LRF rods, or light game rods, is a massive topic to talk about, to be honest. It's one of those that I've probably been even putting off making this video because I feel like there's almost too many little points that I will scare myself if I forget to mention them. But they're so varied in style. I mean, the Japanese are very specific about what they do with regards to all fishing rods. Design, they'll take everything and look at every tiny piece of a rod before it reaches its final conclusion. And far more so, I think, than most people realise. Every single piece of every guide, or the way the blank is, or the way the tip is put together, is very intentional across the different ranges that are created. Having spoken to Japanese brands about the design process, it's very, very detailed. It's not like they've just chucked something on. You definitely will see that elsewhere in the world, but actually, certainly within these proper rods, for want of a better word, they are done for a reason. And it's just to us to try and, with the language barrier, to try and understand a little bit of why they do certain things, but also just from experience, get to know what we like as well, because I think the UK is an interesting place with regards to this style of fishing. We've started perhaps following very much the Japanese styles, then we've kind of developed our own and gone now down an avenue where we're very, very good at species hunting, for example, which is almost more as to what LRF has become. But there's rods for different jobs, and certainly within the shop, I perhaps see a lack of details about certain things out there. Again, it's difficult because I want people to understand these rods, but on the whole, most people will come to us and just say, I want a 6'6" rod rated 3 grams, and that's just what they buy. But there's massive differences across the ranges, whether it's length, tip type, or action as well. All of them good for different things, and it's just in understanding those design ideas and knowing how to apply them to our fishing that will actually just make your life way easier. And with this sort of fishing, it will make you catch more fish if you have the right rod. So the types of lures we use are varied, as you'll know. So we fish soft plastics, we fish sort of little biodegradable baits like Eco Garakwa, the Maruku Isame, the Gulp, things like that. A lot of that sort of thing with our species hunting these days. Now, having the right rod for certain situations just is essential. Tip types. Solid tips, I think, have definitely become the most popular, and that's for good reason, because when we first started selling our LRF rods sort of back in 2010, there was basically a divide between either solid or tubular, and that was it. And we used solid tips for either lightweight soft plastics or perhaps very light stuff down the wall. And then we used our tubular tips for our little metal jigs, or just slightly larger jig heads, over about 2 grams, let's say, as an average. And in a way, the world was simple, and it was actually quite nice because, yeah, everything was obvious. Now, and especially with the development of solid tips, the solid tip has changed massively to the point where tubular tips are far less common, because in certain situations we just don't need them anymore, because there are solid tips now that take over those jobs that the tubular previously was great at. There's still benefits to tubulars, which I'll obviously talk about in a minute, but it's with the solid tips that we'll start. And the easiest way to look at them is that they vary in length and in taper, and that's really the two numbers effectively that give us this differentiation between what could be very long and soft all the way through to actually very short solid tips, which can be very fast taper and really quite stiff. So those being the ones that perhaps take over some of what the tubular tip rods previously did for us. So examples being, for example, the great range for me to talk about is actually the Graphic Leader Corto UX. This is one of those ranges where you have rods within this big range that have 2 different types of solid tips involved. So you have actually what is their general S range. You'll see it in the product codes where it's something -S. And then some of them will be -HS. So welcome to correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's hard solid that it stands for. So the differentiation, to differentiate between the two, you've got your HS tips are actually they're a bit stiffer basically. I mean, they're typically a little bit thicker at the very tip end. And then they can, with the case of these, they actually come back to relatively similar diameters once you get to the base of picked up the wrong rod, doesn't help. Once you get to the base of the solid tip, they'll be similar, but it's at the tip where the HS rods, being slightly stiffer, are slightly wider diameter at the very tip. So it's that style of rod that if you're going to be jerking lures around a lot, they can be very light lures, but if you're going to be very twitchy with all your lures, those HS rods can be great for that. Whether it's a little metal, whether it's a little plug, whether it's a slightly heavy soft plastic, like we said, they're a very, very versatile type of rod, and that's probably the one that sits right in the middle now of it all, that didn't exist before. And it's filled this sort of all-rounder gap within LRF rods, and I love that. I love it for that. And it's the style of rod that probably I would choose a lot myself, because as much as I personally prefer the rods a little bit longer on the whole, this short solid gives you the benefits of almost both worlds. It's like we've discussed recently in our bass fishing video of a similar topic, the fact that there's never anything that's perfect for everything, and being a bit in the middle, it's neither perfect for the lightest rigs and it's neither perfect for fishing plugs or anything like that, but it's your all-rounder. So if you want one rod to do as much as everything with, then it's those HS tips within the likes of either the Corto UX range or numerous others that are kind of really filling those gaps. With regards to those lighter solid tips, these are the sorts of rods that we'd use and I think probably are the most popular on the whole, because now we've gone down this direction of so much species hunting, where these light solid tips are great for very light rigs, for sort of feeling the sort of like delicate bites down the edge and things like that as well, whether it's in a rod pool, whether it's on a harbour, wherever. And they give you that ultra light sensitivity. So they are typically the softest rods with the lowest ratings, maximum casting weights. And we're looking at things, I mean, for example, one that I quite like is actually the Graphite Leader Finezza UX. I don't mean to necessarily be on Graphite Leader rods, but the benefit of me sticking to one brand is you kind of get those obvious differences between the way that they're rated. And the letters they use are quite consistent across the brands. But with the likes of the Finezza UX, you have this kind of slightly slower taper solid tip, because taper is something in its own right, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you have this slightly slower taper tip, which then means that the likes of this Finezza is light, but then slightly more progressive in this middle section as well. So to jump into action, because it's sort of relevant right now obviously, is if you are casting light lures, the lights of the Finezza could potentially be the one I choose over the Corto, because of the fact that it is going to bend. It's got the lightness in the tip to kind of feel that contact as the line comes through the tip. The tip is bending slightly into the weight of the lure, creating that friction on the guides, which is then transmitted to the blank, which will make it to your hand so you can feel what's going on a bit more so, or you can feel the tension so you know that you're actually doing something. You don't get that with a stiff tip. So progressive in towards the middle, so you've got that casting, and then great for retrieving stuff, basically, this sort of style of slightly longer, slightly more progressive rod. So, and that's what I've always enjoyed, those sort of old school elements of LRF in a way, where you've got these soft plastics, jig heads, fishing for the stuff that's actually out in open water, rather than spending your life down the edge. There are benefits though as well to the length of these rods to go slightly longer when you're in that scenario, but I'll leave that for just a second, because there are other types of solid tip which are coming in now as well. This is not necessarily technically different in how you'd fish it, but this is the Tailwalk Super Agis TZ, and this one actually has a titanium section to the tip. So this is a bit magic in a way, in that titanium is a material that's almost indestructible in this respect. I mean, it's genuinely a rod where I can just bend the tip round and I have no fear. I don't do that with any other rod that we sell because it would be stupid. But you've got absolute durability at the tip end, and we've sort of joked, as much as it's actually a very expensive rod for this style of fishing, very good rod, but it's the sort of rod that would perfectly suit just plonking it into a hole in a rock pool somewhere. Massively overkill because it's way too good, but having that tip means that you can kind of really get right in there when you want to. Being a solid material is actually designed really, and the point of the rod is, as an agi rod, it's designed for fishing sort of little soft plastics on the drop and stuff like that. So you've got just massive feeling when you're just sort of feeling that lure down as it sinks. So just worth mentioning because it's such an interesting range, an interesting idea that we don't see on lots of rods, but the technical reasons and the durability side is just amazing. But three types of solid tip. Standard S, which is your softer action, HS, which is your technically slower taper but slightly stiffer, and then you've got the likes of your titanium. So you've got these three different types to kind of try and suit different types of fishing. I would say, just to summarize that before I jump onto the next bit, like I said, lighter tips for either lighter lures or for fishing down the edge. It's very good for that as well, because you don't want a fish, especially a small one, to come into a lure, grab it and just feel all this stiffness from the rod tip, because they're very likely just to spit it out sooner rather than later. So even if just a softer tip buys you an extra split second to actually have a fish more easily and properly devour a bait while it's down the wall or wherever, it's just potentially going to add that percentage of benefit to you. So, and then you've got your titanium, which is a little bit in the middle, but it's more of a specialist rod, I'd say, for that on the drop type stuff, which I love. I just wish more people did it these days. Then you've got your tubular tips. So this is, like I say, this is sort of perhaps the old school way in a way, but it's still absolutely the way that I would fish if I was out on the north coast here, for example, or anywhere where I was off either a harbour or a rock mark, where I'm fishing either slightly larger soft plastics, like say 2 grams plus really, or metal jigs and vibration baits as well, because it's great for that. Because you've got that stiffness in the tip, doesn't mean the whole rod is stiff, because they actually, again, can be slightly more parabolic in a way, depending on the brand and the rod that you go for, but it means that you can cast those metals and work them and fish them more easily without the solid tip just folding into it too easily. So great rods for those slightly bigger fishing. I almost refer to them as like summer LRF rods in a way, when we're actually out catching sort of mackerel, pollock, bass, things like that, rather than the smaller bits and pieces down the edge. So length is almost the next topic really. Length is something that's, again, changed throughout the years as people here have kind of grown their own preferences as to whichever style of light game or LRF fishing they want to do. I prefer them longer, partly perhaps because of the location. I mean, I'm here in Cornwall. We can fish a lot of open coast marks and things like that, and the extra length gives us a little bit more distance when we're casting further out. Also gives us a bit more line control in the wind, and also enables us to, again, wind specific really, just keep the tip down a bit when we want to get it out of the wind. Because you might sometimes find you're having to stand a bit further up off the water, so a longer rod is absolutely better for those scenarios. I think, like I say, it's a shame in a way that most people just come to us now and just want to buy a really standard default LRF rod for every type of fishing, because that sort of works to a certain extent with species hunting on the whole, but there's so many types of LRF and light game fishing that we could be making more of if we just looked a little bit outside of that real niche. So the range is massive and varied, and I love it for that, more so than any other type of rod that we sell, because once you get lighter, things get a lot more specific in the differences between them. There can be, as you might know, there can be a huge difference between an LRF rod rated to 3 grams and one rated to 5 grams, massively different. And then you add tips and tapers and whatever else onto it, then you've got a whole another kettle of fish really. So we've done, like I say, length. I prefer them over 7 foot, I think, for that, even for the down the wall stuff, because it means you can actually, when you've hooked a fish, you can actually pull it out. Sometimes you've got the little blennies and things like that, blennies in particular, where they're trying to dive into the weeds that might be sort of floating along the edge of the wall. And actually, if you go for like a 5 foot something, 6 foot something rod, you've not always got that leverage to pull them out. With a 7 foot rod, you've still got all the control, if any, because all you have to do is just stand slightly sideways, and you've still got the line right in down the wall, but you've got much more control because you might be higher up. There's loads of benefits to a slightly longer rod. For absolute control, when you have got calmer conditions or you're closer to water level, that's when the shorter rods do come into their own. So there's absolutely a time and a place for those rods. The Japanese guys who are designing them, who I obviously have massive respect for, they will use a lot of these very short rods, but they're using them more often than not in different scenarios than what we're buying them for. So I think for, like I say, especially for lightweight jig heads, casting and retrieving, sort of almost sink and draw type stuff, a bit more complex than that as regards to how I'd explain it generally. But the shorter rods absolutely come into their own if you're doing that sort of fishing. If you're fishing a canal even, for example, because these rods transfer so perfectly, obviously, into the freshwater world within our perch fishing. They cover everything on that side in terms of ultralight fishing in freshwater too. Trout even as well. I mean, I've even got an example of a trout rod around here somewhere, because that again has that different level of action where it can be very parabolic with a trout rod. So to summarise a little bit with regards to rods and weights, I think all that's important with any rod of any style is that you can actually put a bend in it when you're casting. Because if you can't, the rod isn't going to be able to do its job of projecting the lure and the weight to where it's going to be. So going too stiff is a problem, as is going too light, because actually, aside from the fact that it might struggle to cast a heavier lure, you've also just got a certain level of wobbliness that kicks in eventually, and it means that you're not getting that level of contact or control. So again, it's a trend very much at the moment where everybody just seems to want to buy the lightest rating they can, and that, again, similar to the bass and wrasse video that we did as well with rods, it can be deceiving, because depending on the brand, depending on the style of rod, it's like they have different ways of rating them. So if you just want to buy a 3 gram rod, you could buy one 3 gram, or you could come and see us and see one 3 gram rated rod that actually is really stiff and you feel like you could chuck 7 on. And then you've got others where you'd be sort of like, oh, anything over 2 is pushing it. So you've got to be really careful buying with the ratings. There's not a lot you can do about it, because there's not really the information out there unless you can physically see the rods to compare. And that's why I'd always suggest, if you ever want to, just call us or send us a message, and we can obviously try and help describe more specifically what some of these rods will do. Tell us what you want to do to the type of fishing you're doing, and there's going to be a rod that will do that. It just might not necessarily, and in lots of cases, probably isn't one you've even got in your head that you've seen. So there's always better out there, and I like that about fishing rods. So I think that has most of these things covered within this sort of light game side of things. Length, like I say, you can come short, but make sure you're fishing at either close range or you can actually get that maneuverability that you need, assuming there's no snags or anything like that. Short is great as well for sort of contact and control. Also just makes it very easy if you're twitching your lure around, obviously. But if you are retrieving or fishing from high up or fishing windy conditions, have a look at the longer rods, because there's so many situations where I think from a personal point of view, if I was to buy one LRF rod to suit UK fishing, it would be probably 7'4" or something like that, just as an average. I mean, anything between 7'2", 7'6", I like those sorts of lengths, with let's say a short solid tip, a hard solid, to make it as versatile as it can be. So, like I say, get in contact if you need if you've got any questions at all. We're always happy to help out and answer more than I can explain in these videos about specific details. So drop us a comment, subscribe to the channel, follow us online.